So, but liberty is liberty. I only realized about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, that the century-long attack on male homosexuals was confined to Northern Europe. It's the Germans, the Dutch, the English, and their offshoots who would put people in jail, would imprison.
Like with Alan Turing, for example.
Exactly. That movie has been very important in reminding people that there really was a reign of terror.
Esto es La Inquietud con Garret Edwards, el lugar donde hay más preguntas que certezas.
Compartimos ahora una reciente entrevista a DEIRDRE MCCLOSKEY, la genial economista que hiciera para Fundación Libertad y para la Fundación Internacional para la Libertad, presidida por el Premio Nobel de Literatura Mario Vargas Llosa, el pasado miércoles 6 de abril de 2022, así que disfruten de McCloskey. Bienvenidos, estamos abriendo aquí otro evento de Fundación Libertad y de la Fundación Internacional para la Libertad. Ya se va sumando la gente, habíamos puesto las 12 horas y corresponde 2 horas Argentina que demos inicio. Vamos a tener un verdadero placer. Yo estoy haciendo la presentación en español, ya está DEIRDRE MCCLOSKEY aquí con nosotros. Seguramente entenderá lo que vamos diciendo y luego ella sumará en inglés. Voy a hacer la presentación en español, luego nos vamos a pasar al inglés. Digo, esto es uno de esos placeres que nos damos, uno de esos lujos, una vez al año, a veces un poco más, a veces un poco menos, de charlar, de tenerla de invitada aquí a DEIRDRE MCCLOSKEY. DEIRDRE es profesora distinguida emérita de Economía e Historia, profesora emérita de Inglés y de Comunicación en la Universidad de Illinois en Chicago. Se estudió en la Universidad de Harvard en la década del 60 como economista. Ha escrito más de 20 libros, más de 400 artículos académicos sobre teoría económica, sobre historia económica, sobre filosofía, sobre retórica, sobre teoría estadística, sobre feminismo, sobre ética, sobre derecho. Enseñó por 12 años en la Universidad de Chicago en el Departamento de Economía en sus días de gloria. Se describe a sí misma, acá va a hacer la cuenta, va a poner los números y los dedos. Yo ahí traduzco: literaria, cuantitativa, posmoderna, de libre mercado, progresista, episcopaliana, ex-marxista, una mujer del medio oeste de Boston que alguna vez fue hombre, no conservadora, soy una cristiana liberal clásica. I know that DEIRDRE would get exactly that one when I was saying it in Spanish, and that she would count them one by one as she always does, and she keeps updating that description. Sus libros más recientes, por ejemplo, incluyen ¿Por qué funciona el liberalismo? ¿Cómo los verdaderos valores liberales producen un mundo más libre, más igual y más próspero para todos? Con la editorial de la Universidad de Yale en el 2019. Publicó recientemente con Art Carden Déjenme solo y los volveré ricos, el trato burgués, con la editorial de la Universidad de Chicago en el 2020. Yo leí hace algunos años y me emocionó muchísimo. I read a few years ago, DEIRDRE, Crossing a Memoir, which I really loved. I read the updated version when I was at the American Institute for Economic Research, where you left a signed copy there. I read that signed copy, DEIRDRE, while I was visiting. And we have so many things to talk about with DEIRDRE today. Professora DEIRDRE MCCLOSKEY, so pleased to have you here with us today.
Well, I'm extremely pleased to be here. I just wish I was actually in Argentina, but I'm really there in some other sense of real. I so apologize that I have to speak in English. I have a Spanish joke which I want you to hear. Someone who has 3 languages is called trilingual. Someone who has 2 is called bilingual. Someone who has 1 is called una gringa.
we got that one because it even includes Spanish and Mexican slang. Una gringa. We are pleased to have you, DEIRDRE, as I said, and you understand more Spanish that you are letting us see, because
the actual truth is that when I was taking care of my mother in the last year of her life, helping take care of her, I decided to learn some Spanish. So I went to Lingua, what's it called? Anyway, to this free thing. And I got enough so that as you were introducing me in your generous way, I got a lot of I could follow it a little bit. So, so it was a revelation to me that us in Spanish is nosotros.
Exactly. you perfectly got that one, Deirdre. We have about an hour together. We're inviting people, of course, to add questions. They have the chat box ready if they want to start writing. People keep joining up. I would like to start with something that you wrote in 2020. It's on your website, Deirdre McCloskey. When you had the elections in the US and we had the pandemic, and the title was Globalization Will Resume, which I really loved. Globalization will resume. Did globalization resume, Deirdre?
Well, yes, it did. I think there's an economic reason for a V recovery as against a down and then eventually up. Which is that those opportunities that globalization provides still exist. It's still advantageous for Argentina, as it has for 150 years, to export beef. And if temporarily it's stopped by regulations or by, Putin's war, nonetheless, it's still there. When, it was terrible the way in the United States and doubtless in Argentina, little restaurants closed all over the place. And that's very sad for the entrepreneurs and who made the restaurants in the first place. But on the other hand, there's an opportunity for someone else, or maybe the same person, to start it up again once the fog lifts.
That's incredible, Deirdre. I would like to continue because you just put it in perfect words. Putin's war.
Yeah.
How have you been analyzing the war so far?
Well, I think, as we say in education, that it's a teaching moment. I mean, most of our fellow citizens don't pay a lot of attention to politics, and I'm perfectly okay with that. They've got their own lives and their families and so forth, and so they tend to accept the spectrum between left and right and middle as somehow the only way to analyze politics. But what Putin has made absolutely clear is that it's not this horizontal left-right stuff that's all that important, as long as we don't go to the extreme of fascism or communism. But what matters is the axis up and down of I always stutter on the word liberty. It's so irritating. It's my favorite word.
It's paradoxical.
It is paradoxical, but liberty versus slavery. It's so clear that Putin is a slave master, and his invasion of Ukraine is that of a slave master angry that his slaves don't obey him. And indeed, he's completely fooled with his control over TV, especially. He's got his hands on the minds of the Russian people, and they're going to be so sad when they learn the truth. By the way, there's an analogy that I wish more Americans would mention, which is how we didn't know what was going on in Vietnam. It was a long time ago. But, and I don't want to say that that President Johnson was like Putin. Putin is on another level of slavery, of tyranny. But it is true that the United States was committing war crimes in Vietnam. I protested along with lots of other people at the time. And the actual truth is that war tends to produce war crimes. Surprise, surprise. So that's my opinion. So here's my point, that I think maybe this is an opportunity for us to say, dears, to our friends, dears, have you noticed there's a difference between the liberty that the Ukrainians want and the slavery that Russia offers?
Deirdre, you just made a really important and clear point, and I want to link it with something that we were discussing right before we opened this Zoom and this conversation, because you just said we have liberty versus slavery, which is something that Putin is offering and putting on the table, and the very thing that the Ukrainian people are trying to fight for and defend, which is their liberty. Isn't it incredible that it is the 21st century and we still have people that need to be told that slavery is a bad thing?
Yeah, and the problem is this: the slavery of wife to husband, the slavery of master to actual slave, the slavery of ordinary citizens to the Argentinian state, are all said to be and justified often by saying, well, dear, I know what's good for you, you poor thing. And that's been very persuasive in the last 100 years in your country and mine. And the trouble is that it's extremely implausible that someone in the capital knows that you want a loaf of bread this afternoon. And it's that detail of wants, of desires, of that markets and other spontaneous orders like language, friendship, art, science provide, in detail. Whereas top-down, say, industrial policy, as we're calling it these days, or central planning from the capital, I mean, it's just implausible on its face. It doesn't look very plausible that some smart person in the industrial planning agency knows better than some entrepreneur on the scene. And I want to emphasize that most of our lives take place in these spontaneous orders, as Hayek called them. Language, the Spanish language could be improved, I suppose. So could English. In English, if we would spell things as they sound, that would help people a lot.
It definitely would.
Oh God, I don't know how anyone learns that knight, like a guy with a sword, is spelt the way it's spelled. Anyway,
it has a K. We don't pronounce it, but it's
there. It is a K. Whereas in the 14th century, it was so pronounced. Okay, so there are all these spontaneous orders of, say, the friends we have, the actual friends, or the people we marry, or our lovers, or our science. Science as an organization, organization isn't quite the word, but as a practice, involves deciding what's the next important thing to look into, right? And economic science is the same way. And it doesn't always choose the correct one, I admit it. But is the directionality of science going to be improved by having a bunch of people in London deciding it? And I don't think so.
Deirdre, about central planners, I was born in 1989. I consider myself a 90s kid, but I have a fondness for the 80s, and now that's coming back, and you see movies, and you see books, and you see TV shows. But the question is not as fun as it sounds, because there seems to be a fondness for Soviet times in some countries and from some people, and that's quite worrisome.
Yeah, well, it's a spectacular example is Hungary, where Ban just won. It has to be said, a rather fixed election. It was not an honest measure of public opinion in Hungary, but still he won the election, and he calls himself a democratic illiberal. And that, by the way, is quite common. The Peronistas, of whom I don't need to tell you, there are plenty, not just in Argentina, but in Latin America generally.
We export them.
Yeah, they're often supported by majorities. Hitler was elected there, and Mussolini was popular until he started to lose wars. So majority vote, although I'm very much in favor of it, is not sufficient. You also need a commitment to non-slavery. That my husband tells me what to do. No, he can't. He's not permitted to.
Which is incredible, Deirdre, because you have also written about gender studies, and we saw that shift. You just used the perfect example with the husband and the wife. In most countries in the West, from the second half of the 20th century onwards, which means we still have a long way to go, because those things that should be basic and essential, which are not still spread all over the world, they are quite recent when you take it into account the history.
They are. I'm fond of saying, and I'm sure most people here agree, liberty is liberty is liberty. Whether it's about, I don't know, the regulation of the Spanish language, or the regulation of the economy, or the regulation of whom you love, or what identity you have, as long as you're not hurting other people in a particular way, my right to wave my hand around is absolute unless I hit your nose. And actually, by the way, a lot of my friends, my liberal friends, seem to think there's no case for quarantine or for any regulation having to do with COVID-19. But look, your right to blow things up my nose stops when it makes me sick, right? So, but liberty is liberty. I only realized about 4 or 5 years ago, that the century-long attack on male homosexuals was confined to Northern Europe. It's the Germans, the Dutch, the English, and their offshoots who would put people in jail, would imprison.
Like with Alan Turing, for example.
Exactly. That movie has been very important in reminding people that there really was a reign of terror. Now, I knew it because I'm old enough, but I was not gay, alas. That would have been, if I had discovered at age 53 that I was homosexual, that would have been so much easier than discovering at 53. Sorry, I have to stop this.
Yes, no problem.
Oh, God damn it. Sorry about this.
No problem at all, Deirdre.
Here I go.
This is real life. People call telephone sound.
That's right. But I discovered at age 53 that I could do something I had wanted to do since age 11, so far as gender identity is concerned. But it was amazing to me that there's nothing in French, Italian, or Spanish, or Greek law for that matter, that makes homosexuality a state crime. It's said to be a crime by the church, but the church doesn't hand people over to be imprisoned. And I'm not sure about the situation in Argentina, but I don't think, were there ever laws?
No, I don't recall ever having laws in
Most of
such a
Latin
way.
America.
Of course, you may have had at some points in Argentina's history discrimination and
Yeah, that's right.
persecution.
That's right. But that's very different from coercion. Persuasion, contempt, even excommunication, to take the extreme case, is not the same thing as grabbing someone. To take an interesting case that Argentinians are very familiar with, taking them out over the South Atlantic and dropping them out of a plane. That's different from
Completely different.
non-physical violence.
Deirdre, I would like to link this with a few concepts that you have been using in the past few years, because you also talk about adultism and innovism, not just liberalism and capitalism. And I think it ties nicely with these examples that you have just been saying when you talk about the possibility of choosing our own lives, doing whatever we want, just as long as we don't mess with other people's lives and their own liberties. Are we adults now, or do we still have a long way to get there?
We have a long way to go, but mainly because most of us, like my friend Joe Mulcair, a great economic historian, are persuaded that the state should have massive powers to intervene. And as I said, I don't understand this, because Joe would not say that the state should intervene in who he's friends with. He's long been a very dear and close friend of mine. And suppose the government decides, well, that's unhealthy. I mean, look, Xi Jinping's China is moving that way, decidedly. And it's the vision of 1984 by George Orwell. And it's very, very bad. So I'm puzzled why free-thinking people don't get this. It's only about a century that people have really thought that the government should intervene in the economy in a massive way. Although in England, it started about 150 years ago. It was called in the 1880s, the New Liberalism. Early in the 1800s, Britain, of course, was the great, hero of liberalism. But then in the 1870s, and especially the 1880s, a so-called new liberalism arose in the minds of intellectuals. And it was the opposite of liberalism, because it said, the state knows what you want. And the old joke is, I'm from the government, and the punchline is, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you.
And I'll respect you in the morning, as you always say in the joke.
That's right. Those are the three things. The check is in the mail. Of course, I'll respect you in the morning, and I'm from the government and I'm here to help you.
They are never there to help, and they will not respect us in the morning. You were speaking about new liberalism, so I have this here because I would have this here. I have the theory of moral sentiments.
Okay, I'm going to cross myself, as I always do in the presence of
Adam Smith. So there has been this tendency in science and in ideology of adding new to everything. But here we have a classic, which is a classic for a reason. Are we reading? Are we thinking? Are we speaking enough about Adam Smith in 2022?
Well, much more than we did, say, half a century ago. For a long time, Smith was kind of dismissed by professional philosophers and a lot of other people as, oh, well, he's a right-wing ideologue and we don't need to pay attention to him. Rather the way St. Thomas Aquinas is dismissed by non-Catholics as, oh, well, he's just dogma in the Catholic Church and I don't need to pay attention to him. Both of these people, Smith and Aquinas, were brilliant philosophers. And they were very, very, no, I don't agree with everything either one says, but I agree with much of what Adam Smith says and a lot of what Aquinas says. But in the last, especially increasingly over the last 50 years, philosophers, political philosophers, and so on have started to pay attention to Smith. Now, look, he only wrote 2 books. He would not get tenure at a major economics department. And he wrote no articles in the American Economic Review. Can you believe that?
Yeah, he'd be a failure for
completely incompetent, a complete failure. He only wrote 2. And
he'd be a hack.
He'd be a hack, and no one would pay any attention to it. But no, look, he's the one of the expressions. There are a number of others: Voltaire, Mary Wollstonecraft, the anti-slavery agitators, and a number of others who in the 18th century and very early 19th exhibit liberalism. And liberalism at the time was a very strange idea because these people lived in a society since the invention of agriculture in which everyone had a master. And the idea that no one should have a master sounded to most people in the 18th century as completely loco, insane, crazy. Yet a few of these intellectuals started to think about it for reasons that I could go into, but this was what made for this idea that the great first achievement of liberalism, even in Russia, was the abolition of slavery and serfdom.
Deirdre, we have budget for the next question. We got one of H.G. Wells' his time machine at the discount, so we'll take you back in time. We were with Adam Smith, so I'm going to ask you something that I never asked you before. If you had Adam Smith next to you, you are maybe sharing a cup of coffee or maybe sharing a whiskey or whatever, and you can ask him anything at all, anything, and he will answer. He will answer honestly as Adam Smith would. What would you ask Adam Smith?
Well, I would ask him, does it seem to him a fine idea to have 1/3 to half of national income taxed and then spent by the state? And I think I know what he would answer. He would speak of, all over the place, we economists are what he called the men and women dear of system, the people of system, who believe, he said famously, that they can move people around the chessboard of society as easily as can a person move a piece on a chessboard. And this currently popular person, I know that she's well known in Argentina too, Mariana Mazzucato, who's an economist. She's American born and works in Britain, but now she's all over the place. She's advising the Italian government. She's kind of a rock star, like Thomas Piketty, actually. I just did a review of a couple of his new books. And Alberto Mingardi and I have written a short book about her thinking. And it's a revival of this idea that the men and women of system know better than we how to run the Spanish language, personal friendship, jazz, knitting, whatever you think. And I wish we could get through to the average person. Look, here's one of the reasons the average person likes the idea of central regulation. We all come from families. And I hope that most of us came from loving and competent families. So Mama and Papa governed us. And when we were 6 years old, that's how it should be. I hope that your mother didn't send you out to work when you were 6 years old to earn money to pay for lunch. I don't suppose there's anyone here if that's true. But the trouble is, then every generation, when it becomes a teenager, 13, 14, 15 years old, and they notice that they're poor people or that the world is not working perfectly, they then say, well, let's make Argentina into a big family. And, you know, big countries, or most little countries for that matter, don't work well as families. Families are families, and they're socialist. There's absolutely no question about it, and they should be. From each according to her ability, to each according to his need, is how a family works. So every generation is going to believe, let's try socialism once again. Let's go back to Juan Perón once again. Let's go back to Raul Prebisch once again. Let's go back to Lenin once again. And it's, you know, it drives anyone with any sense of history crazy to hear this, but it comes out of this very natural, understandable, charitable indeed, loving idea. Oh, well, let's just make it a big family.
That was great, even including the reference to Prebisch. That was some great Argentinian economic history. Let's go back even farther in time, because this is another author that we'd love to get your professional opinion on, which is Thomas Hobbes. Before the Glorious Revolution in 1688, what's your opinion? How do you perceive Hobbes' ideas?
Hobbes, very interestingly, is claimed quite properly for one big liberal idea he had, which is that the only justification for state power is the welfare of the people. Now, this is not the assumption that it's a commonplace nowadays. We assume, well, of course, government has to be justified as being good for the people. But before Hobbes, people didn't think of it that way. So an earlier example of this fact is Machiavelli, especially in The Prince. Now, he had other places where he was much more liberal, but The Prince, as you know, is a handbook for tyranny. And never does he mention the welfare of ordinary Florentines. It's all about the glory of the prince and how the prince can maintain that position of power. It's a handbook for Putin. Whereas, Hobbes is a mixed bag, as we say in English. You must have a similar Spanish expression, because then he says, aha, the solution is the Leviathan. And this solution is statism. Now, the last book by Ashimoglu and Robinson, which again is quite popular, and lots of people think it's beautiful.
It has been popular here as well, yeah.
Of course it has, and because it's pure statism. They actually acknowledge their debt to Hobbes. They're Hobbesians. And they believe that the Leviathan, the state, should get bigger and bigger and bigger. Then they have this vague idea that society will somehow prevent it from becoming Putin. But that's not smart. It's not smart to make the people in the capital or our masters get them back in charge, and they govern our lives like our parents did, and then expect it not to result in terrible tyranny, because it has more or less every time. So anyway, this is an idea that doesn't ever die. It's the policy idea in economics, which has been popular, very popular for about 100 years. Economists believe that their purpose is to think of new policies over and over and over again. I'm working on a paper called The Impossibility of Policy. They say over and over again, this policy, that policy, this policy, this, and they don't see that spontaneous orders are how most of our lives operate, and that only, child slavery should be abolished. We shouldn't let the market decide. For that matter, slavery of anyone should be a policy. But beyond that, there are very few policies. And then, if there's an invasion, as I expect any day, of Uruguay to invade Argentina, it's
that's gonna happen anytime soon.
Anytime soon. So we need a great big army in Argentina, a grotesquely big army. Of course, my own country is the worst example. A enormously expensive and big army to protect the United States against the Canadians, who are, I can hardly sleep at night worrying about the invasion by the Canadians.
They are going to invade with the mooses and with the maple syrup.
And it's, of course, that's the story that Putin is telling, that the Ukrainians were about to invade Russia.
I'm sure, Deirdre, that everyone that's accompanying us here today and the ones that are seeing this recorded, they are all big fans of your trilogy, the Bourgeois trilogy. It's always a hard word, that one, for me, bourgeois in English. And if they have not read them yet, as you always say, they can go running to Amazon and buy them. You used to have the books with you when you said that.
Buy.
That's a good one. But I wanted to ask you this explanation about how the bourgeois virtues and values work. How applicable do you think they are for the Argentinian case, for Juan Bautista Alberdi's Argentina, the one that the forefathers envisioned back in the 19th century for Argentina?
Well, I think that humans flourish in free societies. I think that's actually how the family should work, and does, usually. We're kind of slaves. It's kind of a stupid expression, but we're slaves to our parents until adolescence. And then the adolescent starts saying to his parents, "Oh, you're not my boss," by which he means am or about to grow up. And then we want people to be free adults. And that, I think, works everywhere. I don't think there's an Argentinian economics, as is often claimed on both the left and the right. It's not confined to, well, it's very common to claim that, well, our circumstances are special, so we need to violate your liberty. And I don't think so. It's hard. Look, here's the point. Ideology is the big thing. The ideology in the United States changed in the 1930s from a kind of fierce devotion to liberty to, oh, let's have the mama and papa state. And in Argentina, starting in the 1930s, but especially with Perón, it too adopted this statist ideology. And until we get people to understand that the state is not your friend, we aren't going to make much progress in people flourishing as free adults. The problem is, of course, that the state can give you personally a favor. It can pay for your higher education, for example. And then, as Count Bismarck, the chancellor of the German Empire, which he created, said explicitly, he said, we're going to introduce, and they did in 1889, old age pensions in the German Empire in order to attach elderly working class people to the Kaiser, to a conservative government. And it succeeded. Bismarckianism is the modern welfare state. So it gives this thing and this thing, and people can't imagine that the world anymore without the state having massive intervention. Let's take a somewhat strange sounding case, roads.
Yeah.
With modern technology, the roads could be private, entirely private, because it's extremely easy to charge for roads. You have a transponder in the automobile, and then you send people a bill as though you're paying for your rent every month, right? And it could be done, and it would work much better than the system we now have. There would be no traffic jams if the roads were privately owned. But we can't imagine it. Actually, in a way, it's a failure of imagination we've got here. People can't imagine leaping over the existing situation and jumping to a completely free society.
You had a great debate last year talking about roads. Is space exploration worth it? You have on your website.
Yeah.
Is it worth it?
I don't think so. I was one, when I was a kid, I was an astronomy enthusiast until I learned that astronomy was applied physics and physics was applied mathematics, and that really turned me off. Then when I became an economist, I had to learn mathematics, which was very painful. But look, it's going to be easy in 100 years to colonize Mars if we want it. It's going to be a snap because technology is going to continue to improve. I don't know how, or else I would be enormously wealthy, but it'll improve, and we'll have, I don't know, atomic rocket ships and ways of terraforming Mars so that it has an atmosphere that we can breathe, say. I don't know. There are various possibilities. Now it's extremely expensive to get to Mars. It's like,
and it's usually
Columbus.
one way only.
One way only. That's the trouble. And it's like Columbus with his little ships that could fit into your apartment. They were that small. Look, would have been much easier to wait to discover, as we say with insult to the Indios, to discover the new world.
Indeed.
Et cetera. And so, although it's glorious, glory doesn't feed people.
Deirdre, I know that there are a lot of fans of one of your books, which is Economical Writing, 35 Rules for Clear and Persuasive Prose. Which is the most important rule, the one that you always go back to without having to check all the 35 of them?
Well, one that I use all the time is express parallel ideas in parallel form. This means that if you start with one kind of sentence if the next idea is parallel, is a similar idea, or you want to make parallels, form the sentence the same way you did the other one. And that silently signals to the author, I mean to the reader, that these ideas are parallel. And I tell you, I use that idea every time I write the next sentence. And if you do it, you'll find that your writing is much clearer. Now, I don't claim that I'm a perfect writer or anything like that.
Oh, but you're close to one.
No. Every time I get proud, I open the New Yorker magazine and I read an article and I think, and I'm ashamed at what a bad writer I am.
Deirdre, when you write, are you more of a sculptor, or are you trying to get to the perfect version of what you're thinking and trying to put it into words, or is it more of an inspiration burst kind of writing?
No. At first, it's inspiration, and you got to use your creativity from all sources where it comes from, because you've read something that stimulated you, or because your husband said such and such yesterday. You have to use for what was called in the ancient times invention, inventio in Latin. Use every source, but then good prose comes from revise. I just wrote a piece in Follow in Brazil. I sent it off yesterday, and it was 375 words exactly. That was what they asked me to do, and I worked on it for an afternoon. I didn't just rip it off and send it off. I kept saying, I've done what's known in the trade as elegant variation, somewhat similar to express parallel ideas in parallel form. Namely, I've used another word for what I just called X. I've used Y. Don't. If you start with X, you got to use X. You can use it if you want, but you have to.
I personally love Rule 26. Avoid words that bad writers love, Deirdre. Is there any word that bad writers are loving right now?
Well, the one that let's see, there are a number that are kind of signals that you might as well put at the beginning of your piece. I am a bad writer. Because in English, and there have to be.
So we don't lose our time reading. It's like when you have reading time, how many minutes, and the main words that you should take into account that are going to appear in the piece.
I'm not sure if I'm going to get the main ones, but here's one: state. When you say, I don't mean state in the sense of the government. I mean state in the sense of speak or say. That's a junior word. You should use a more precise word. Says is okay, but declare, claims, asserts, depending on what you want to say about the assertion that someone is making.
Deirdre, you recently were at the Cato Institute at Washington, D.C.
For a month.
As the first Anne Smith Fellow there. And how is Washington, D.C.? How did you find
terrible. It's just an awful place. The food is good, although expensive. And by the way, in that month, I only gained 1 kilo. I was so pleased when I got home on my scale and found I'd only gained.
You're using kilos.
Well, it's because
royal measurements.
Well, I'm speaking to people who use kilos, so I think I might as well.
Yeah, we don't know how many pounds is a kilo, so
about 2 pounds. Just
yeah.
It's a terrible place because, of course, that all these well-dressed young people walking around are conspiring to take away my income and use it for stupid things. Now, I happen to think that its use to help the Ukrainians is a great idea, but there are many things the government does that I don't think are great ideas.
I would like to take advantage of the fact that we have you here, Deirdre, in the last few minutes of our allocated time today. And let's circle back to the States, because we were speaking about Washington, D.C. You were quite worried last year about the chance that Donald Trump might make a comeback. I know that you are not happy either with neither with Joe Biden. It's not that you like one or the other. It's just.
No, but come on, look. He's a vast improvement over Donald Trump. I would vote for Biden always, and people like him. They're social democrats, and they're moving in that direction, and I don't entirely approve. But that's much better than fascism.
But the question is, are you still worried that he might try to make a comeback next year in the elections?
He will. He will try to make a comeback. I think Putin's war has woken up people to that Trump supports Putin. And I think people are realizing that, whoops, it's not left-right. It's not that he's just right-wing and that's what's dangerous about him. It's that he's a slave master, and like Putin. And that we'd better attend to this vertical axis of liberty versus slavery. I think he's, he goes on saying stupid things, but, he's been saying stupid things for his whole life and has gotten away with it. So it's dangerous. It's still dangerous. So I hope the Democrats put up someone who can win. Because look, in our system, as in Britain and Canada, it's basically only two parties.
Yeah, it's a factual bipartisan.
That's right. It's called first past the post elections we've got to, so the Democrats really can't put up some of the people who are leading now. The vice president, for example, she's not, I'm all in favor of her. She's a South Asian, African-American woman. I mean, I'm all for that. But she's not forceful enough. She's not, she's, what Democratic politics needs, small d Democrat in Argentina and anywhere else, is people who are eloquent, people who are rhetorically good. Obama was the top of this. I didn't agree with his policies, all his policies, but Obama is an incredibly eloquent speaker. And Churchill was that way. And Reagan was that way. And that's what we need. That's what the Democrats need to find, is someone like Obama.
Deirdre, last questions. We'll see if we get one in the chat box as well, so I'll give them time to write. But I would like to touch upon by the end with something that we have talked a lot and that I have seen you talk about in the last couple of years. It has to do with movies, because I know you like movies, and I know you like Joy, and I know you like The Founder. Have you managed to add another one to the list in the past few years?
There aren't too many, but It's a Wonderful Life from long ago, 1944 or so, or 45, I guess, is one of them. And in a lot of ways, some of my favorites, like Casablanca, which is one of those movies I cannot, now hear what I say carefully, that I cannot not watch.
when you catch it on the TV,
when I catch it on TV, I have to finish watching Casablanca, and it's non-statist, whereas another one that I can't not watch, namely Star Wars, is statist in its basic presumption. There's a bad empire, but then there's a good queendom with a top queen who decides everything. And so it, as a lot of science fiction is, it's essentially in favor of empires. I would, one person who was not statist, Argentinian, is Luis Borges.
Yeah, Jorge Luis Borges.
And he was very
Genius.
unpopular with the government of Argentina.
They have had to get used to him because he's the best. So
Yeah, I know. It's the same way that that Picasso in Paris during the war didn't have to be fearful of the Germans. He didn't use it for anything good because he was such a terrible jerk. But Picasso was by that time untouchable. And
DEIRDRE,
Borges was the same way.
this is a spontaneous order because I would have never thought an hour ago that I would be asking this follow-up question. But what do you think of the new Star Wars trilogy, since we spoke about Star Wars?
Well, I haven't
watch it?
seen all of it, and some of it is really weak. I don't know about I'm not sure what you mean by the new one. Is there one that's new, entirely new?
I mean, it was in 2019, the last one of those.
I know I
movies.
haven't seen that one, but you know,
Well, don't. You'll waste your time.
I know, but the first one was brilliant
Yeah, it was
and
perfect.
statist.
And the second one was a great one as well,
Yeah.
episode 5.
Yeah. that's
DEIRDRE, I'll ask you the last question. This one is one that I have been asking all of my interviewees for my radio show on CNN Radio Rosario, because the show, it's named in Spanish, La Inquietud, which is a word that can mean two things in English. It can mean the question in like a really old and formal way of saying that word instead of pregunta, and it can also mean restlessness. So the question, which
That's
restlessness, yeah. So the question is, what makes DEIRDRE McCloskey restless?
Well, personally speaking, the reaction which spread from Eastern Europe against gay GLBTQ people, which now, the Republican Party has been taken over by anti-gay people, and it's very dangerous for such a minority. That makes me uneasy. Look, I'm very old, so the prospect of death makes me uneasy, but that's true of all humans. The older you get, the more you think about it. But I hope that I get, 5, maybe 10 more years where I can still write and talk to people. Because I've become obsessed with the threat to liberalism worldwide, of which the attack on LGBTQ people is an instance. Liberty is liberty is liberty.
DEIRDRE, querida DEIRDRE, muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much for joining us here today. Last words for this event, something that you want to say before we officially close it?
Bring me to Argentina. Feed me on Argentinian beef. Show me the gauchos. And above all, take me to the real places of the tango.
That we will do. It's a promise, DEIRDRE, and it's a done deal. We'll have you here as soon as possible. It was a pleasure to have you here with us today at this Fundación Libertad and Fundación Internacional para la Libertad event. So people are already writing here at the chat box. They are quite happy, and I'm sure that they are virtually clapping from wherever they are listening to us. And we'll have
Thank
this.
you.
Thank you, Deirdre. We'll have this online at our Fundación Libertad's YouTube channel. And it was a pleasure. We'll see you next time at the Fundación Libertad's event. Muchas gracias a todos. And thank you very much, Deirdre.
Ciao, ciao. Ciao, ciao, bambini, un bacio ancora.
Esto fue La Inquietud con Garret Edwards. Síguenos en redes sociales y en www.edwards.com.ar.